It was the interwar years. The loss of life was still being felt across the far reaches of the country. Edwardian entitlement and the feeling of being empowered had long since gone. The economy had taken a drastic dip, and everyone knew that the only way to get things moving was the motive power that had moved them for the past 100 years: railways. In 1921, the government had restored the railways back to private control following their takeover for the war effort, but the plans were in place to reduce the 130 so companies into 4. On the 1st of January 1923, the Big Four took their places. For the largest of the Big Four, the LMS, things were not going well. It had the largest workforce, the most tracks, and at first each of the 34 railways it controlled kept to its own as though nothing had changed. This carried on for 3 years until the new chairman, Josiah Stamp, stepped into the hot seat. He was set about merging all the individual practices and rules into one. He also looked at the older and deficient fleet. Many of the engines he had control over were underpowered compared to the locomotives on other railways, and many times the engines had to double head just to keep to time. It was costly, both in manpower and coal, and it did not reflect good on the passengers, especially those that were travelling on other routes similar to those with engines that were much more powerful. Sir Henry Fowler was appointed Chief Engineer in 1925 in the hope that he could solve this problem. Henry offered a new 460 passenger tender engine, which was greatly improved on the originals. It was hoped that this smaller engine would provide the power while being less prone to wheel slip, and unlike its LNER counterparts, it would not be need to modify any existing ground structures such as turntables due to the engine's size. After much deliberation and trialling other engines such as the Great Western Castle class, the LMS management agreed, and 50 were ordered at a cost of today of what would be around £12 million. These new engines would be constructed at the North British Locomotive Company Limited in Glasgow. But Fowler had another idea. True, these engines could help the LMS's woes, but what else could he do to give the LMS the upper edge? The answer lay in a new technology called super-powered steam. Steam can expel energy in various ways. One way is by the radiation of heat. It is said that the only way for an engine to be 100% efficient would that be 100% of the steam goes to the cylinders with no loss of energy in the form of heat. Of course, this is perfectly impractical, as expelled heat from burning fuel and steam is used to bring the water up to temperature, and energy is used in other internal parts to overcome friction. When an engine's steam has made a round trip through the cylinders, the steam is then exhausted out the chimney. However, there's still a lot of energy left in this steam, although it will be under much less pressure. So in 1781, the compound theory was introduced. Basically put, when the spent steam exited the cylinder, instead of heading to the chimney, it was recirculated to a larger second cylinder. This cylinder worked under lower pressure and was perfect for the lowered pressured steam. It was first used on steamships, but there was real benefits for locomotives as it meant smoother running with less coal. But that was easier said than done. Steam boilers used in shipping were exceptionally heavy and specially designed to take on extra pressure and higher temperatures. There was no restriction on weight, and unlike locomotive boilers, were relatively immune to the stresses a locomotive had when it came to running. Locomotives had to adjust their pressure according to varying factors, such as speed, terrain, the amount of work it was doing, even the weather played a part, and this constant lowering and increasing of the pressure would not do the boiler any good. Another factor is the boiler itself. When a boiler is heated up, it changes shape and can expand. For maritime and static boilers, this is a good thing. However, on a locomotive, it's not as positive. As the pressures change, the boiler can expand and contract. It didn't help that corrosion was eating away at the boiler at the same time. In pure water and hard water, that's water where soluble salt is converted into insoluble salts, were used in a boiler. As the water is converted to steam, these salts and minerals remain inside a scale. Over time, the scale can build up and cause hotspots within the boiler, which in turn weakens it. In addition, while the boiler is dealing with all of that, the water itself can also be corrosive. Its pH, high carbon dioxide and oxygen content all can eat away at a boiler, and even today this is still one of the leading causes of tube failures. But something had to be done. The engines of the 20s, even the new ones, were highly inefficient, and it is said that 95% of energy produced by a locomotive is wasted. One German engineer, though, thought he had an answer. His name was Wilhelm Schmidt. He claimed that he had made a great breakthrough in locomotive design. The basis of this system, while looking complicated, can actually be broken down. So essentially, Schmidt put a quantity of purified water inside a closed-loop circuit. These were sealed. The tubes would then surround the firebox, which was then superheated to about 900 degrees. This in turn heated a secondary drum full of ordinary water. As the water came into contact with this circuit, it boiled, producing steam. It was theorized that as both the circuit and the water reached an equilibrium, all the energy would go towards heating just the water. As the steam is produced, a quarter of the steam is used for motion, while the rest gets recycled before it's condensed as pure water, free of any minerals. No system, though, is without flaws, and Schmidt knew this. He had to replace the pure water at time to time, so the pure water he made would go back into the system to replace any water he lost. But this system meant that he had high pressure steam they needed to run the cylinder, and in turn the excess steam to run the low pressure cylinders as well. But Schmidt had put his engine into practice, and now Henry Fowler, having heard of it, wanted to try it for himself. In 1928, Fowler, despite issues with funding, gave his backing. It also seemed that the news travelled fast, as Sir Nigel Gresley was also interested in high-pressure steam locomotion, although he kept his gaze on the Americas and their contributions. When Fowler approached to build an engine with the Schmidt design, he jumped at it. The boiler would be made at the British Locomotive Company like the others. It would run on the 460 frame, and the engine would then be tested. The boiler would be paid for by the New Superheater Company Limited, a company built from Schmidt's successes in Europe. The LMS would provide the chassis for free, and if everything went well, they would own the locomotives once the testing was complete. Work started in December 1928, and it was a setup nothing like the LMS had ever seen. A large steam drum was set upon a tubular firebox, filled with heat exchanger coils, and the engine was fixed with two mixing chambers on either side of the smoke box, mixing the superheated steam with the normal, regular exhaust steam. Once done, the engine was named Fury, after the Liverpool and Manchester's 1831 engine and sister to Planet. From the cab, the engine was similar to a standard locomotive, except with a few extra features. There were now 4 water gauges instead of 2, showing high pressure boiler and the low pressure boiler's water levels, and an extra blow-off valves in case of trouble. On the driver's side, it was similar to most steam engines, including a regulator and vacuum braking. For a driver, it was pretty much straightforward, but for the firemen, they now had 2 boilers to worry about. It took a year for the engine to reach steam. The engine had been tested, run on rollers, and ran to within an inch of her life, and she performed admirably. She was handed over to the LMS shortly afterwards to begin her working life and her next stage of her trials. Although the controls were similar to standard locomotives, it still took a few days of running in for her new crew to get to grips with the engine. On the 10th of February, it was decided to take her out. but as the firelighter got the boilers ready, he noted he was not able to see the water level on the closed high-pressure circuit. He told the crew, but both agreed that the water levels would be fine and just to ready the engine. 3 hours later, and with the help of another engine steam to wake her up, Fury left the shed. There were 4 people on the footplate that day, including engineer Lewis Schofield. Schofield was from the heater company, and he was keen to see how the system was running. The fire was built, and the first few miles were uneventful, save for a blowing valve which was hastily fixed. As the engine approached Carstairs, the engine was slowed, and firemen noted that the fire had dropped. As there was going to be a stop, he decided to rebuild the fire before they restarted. As the driver slowed the engine down, the fireman neglected to close the firebox doors. At first this would seem incidental, but in that moment an exchange pipe burst with a loud boom, thrusting boiling hot water, steam and the coals from the firebox straight into the path of the 4 men. The fireman jumped to safety while Schofield took the full force of the blast. The other engineer clung to the edge of the cab while the driver, with his clothes on fire, took charge and brought the engine to a stop. It was said his quick thinking may have saved lives, as the engine would have kept on going and probably crashed. Schofield, though, was not so lucky and succumbed to his injuries the following day. The inquiry was to last a while, and a verdict of accidental death was recorded. Fury was towed to Derby, where William Stanier, who had taken over as chief mechanical engineer of the LMS, was keen to see her steaming in trials once again. It was determined that the whole high-pressure system would need to be replaced, and as she was being worked on, one of the workers caught his finger on a split pin as he worked. The cut was so deep, he had to have his finger amputated. The workers began to agree this engine was clearly living up to its name. But repairs went well, and soon she was back on the testing scene. Poor steaming and large amounts of coal usage were not promising, and after a disastrous run where Fury's left feeder pump failed and her right feeder was doing nothing, her fire was dropped and she was towed back to Derby in shame. But trial after trial went dismally, and in March 1934, Stanier himself decided to call time. This engine simply wasn't working out. In 1935, she was moved to Crewe, stripped down to her frames and refitted with a standard boiler with a new name and number, 6170 British Legion. British Legion would go on to have a quiet life. There were some references to Fury that British Legion retained, such as a longer boiler and side windows, and the cab was new to accommodate for less machinery, but the engine worked right up until the end of steam before being withdrawn. For all its intents and purposes, the theory was there, but for the LMS, Fury was ultimately a failure. Schmidt's work on heating and superheating did, however, help develop the superheader heater, a mainstay in many long-haul locomotives. He passed in 1924, having never seen Fury in action, but it was his inspiration and guidance that allowed many others to develop the modern-day steam engines we love and treasure.